For 30 years, I swallowed doubts, enforced rules, and helped silence questions. Then one night, my wife's life landed in my hands, and truth revealed its price. Closed doors, secret meetings, forgotten victims. I chose love over fear. What happened next? To our family, our faith, our town, no one expects to hear. My name is Raymond Thompson, and for over 30 years, I wore the responsibility of being an elder among Jehovah's Witnesses, like a heavy coat that never quite fit right. The small town of Cedar Falls, Illinois, where I lived and served, had the kind of main street where everyone knew your business before you did yourself. Population 8,400, 2 traffic lights and 1 Kingdom Hall, where I spent the better part of my adult life making decisions that I thought were guided by divine wisdom. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I'd straighten my navy tie, pick up my worn leather Bible, the one with pages soft from 3 decades of use, and drive the familiar route to our meetings. The Kingdom Hall sat on Maple Street, a modest brick building with no cross, no steeple, just clean lines and practical windows that let in exactly enough light during our study sessions. I remember the weight of my elders' responsibility in the smallest details. The way I'd arrive 15 minutes early to unlock the building, the ritual of checking that the microphones worked properly, the careful arrangement of chairs in precise rows. Everything had to be perfect because we represented Jehovah's organization on earth, and perfection was not just expected, it was demanded. Evelyn, my wife of 35 years, would sit in the 3rd row from the front, always the 3rd row, with her own Bible open and her notebook ready for taking notes. She had gentle hands that moved gracefully when she raised them to comment during our study sessions, and a voice that never wavered when she gave her assigned parts on the theocratic ministry school. To the congregation, we were the ideal couple, stable, faithful, unwavering in our dedication. Our daughter Sarah had been baptized at 16, a decision that filled me with pride at the time. She'd stand at the front of the assembly hall in her modest white dress, ready to dedicate her life to Jehovah's service. I remember thinking that day how blessed our family was, how we'd built something pure and lasting in this confused world. But lately, something had been shifting inside me, like a foundation slowly settling in ways that made small cracks appear in walls that had seemed solid for decades. It started with little things. Moments of hesitation before delivering certain talks, a tightness in my chest when reading particular Watchtower articles aloud, dreams that left me restless and questioning things I'd never questioned before. "Raymond, you seem distant lately," Evelyn mentioned one evening as we prepared for bed. We were in our modest 2-bedroom home on Elm Street, the one with the small garden where Evelyn grew tomatoes, and the front porch where we'd sit together on summer evenings, watching neighbors walk their dogs past our neatly trimmed hedge. "Just thinking about the congregation," I replied, which wasn't entirely untrue. But I couldn't tell her about the conversations that happened behind closed doors in the elders' meetings, the decisions we made that sometimes felt more about protecting the organization's reputation than shepherding God's flock. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where everyone attended the same handful of churches, where the Methodist pastor waved at the Baptist minister downtown, where even the Catholics and Lutherans managed cordial relationships during town council meetings. We witnesses kept to ourselves mostly, polite but separate, convinced we alone possessed the truth about God's kingdom. The Kingdom Hall held about 120 people when packed for special events, though our regular attendance hovered around 85 on a good week. I knew every face, every family situation, every spiritual strength and weakness of the publishers in our congregation. As an elder, I was responsible for their spiritual welfare, their moral guidance, their very relationship with Jehovah God. "Brother Thompson, could you stay after the meeting tonight?" David Martinez, our presiding overseer, had asked me the previous Thursday. "We need to discuss some congregation matters." The way he said Matters, with that particular tone, told me it wasn't about scheduling the next circuit overseer's visit or organizing our annual convention travel arrangements. I'd nodded, of course. When the presiding overseer asked you to stay, you stayed. When the organization needed you, you made yourself available. That's how I'd lived for 3 decades, always available, always ready to serve, always willing to put the needs of the organization before my own comfort or convenience. The meeting that night had been about the Henderson family, specifically about young Jennifer Henderson, whose behavior had become what the other elders called concerning. She'd been asking questions during book studies, the kind of questions that made longtime publishers shift uncomfortably in their seats, and new studies look confused about what we actually believed. "She's becoming disruptive," Brother Martinez had said, his fingers drumming against the wooden table in our small conference room behind the main hall. "Brother Williams says she questioned the generation teaching last week, right in front of the new study Sister Peterson brought." I'd felt that familiar tightness in my chest. Jennifer was 19, intelligent, studying nursing at the community college in the next town over. Her questions weren't malicious. They came from genuine curiosity, from a mind trained to examine evidence and think critically. But critical thinking, I was learning, wasn't always welcome when it challenged official doctrine. "Perhaps we could arrange some additional study time with her," I'd suggested. "Help her understand the deeper truths." And even as I said it, something inside me rebelled against the words. Deeper truths. Sometimes I wondered if we were just adding layers of complexity to avoid admitting we didn't have all the answers. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves as I drove home that night. Maple and oak trees lining the streets in brilliant displays of orange and gold. Cedar Falls was beautiful in October, peaceful in a way that made it hard to imagine anything dark or troubling could exist within its boundaries. But I was beginning to understand that darkness didn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wore suits and ties, carried Bibles, and spoke in calm, measured tones about spiritual necessity. Evelyn was reading when I got home, curled up in her favorite armchair with a cup of chamomile tea and the latest Watchtower. The lamp beside her chair cast warm light over her graying brown hair, and for a moment I saw her as she'd been when we first met at a circuit assembly in 1968. Young, earnest, absolutely convinced we were part of something greater than ourselves. "How was the meeting?" she asked without looking up from her magazine. "Fine," I replied, loosening my tie. "Just congregation matters." But it wasn't fine, and we both knew it. Something was shifting in our small, controlled world, and I couldn't shake the feeling that all my years of faithful service were about to be tested in ways I'd never imagined. I need to take you back to understand how I became the man sitting in that elders' meeting, wrestling with doubts I'd never allowed myself to voice. Raymond Thompson wasn't born questioning authority, quite the opposite. I was raised Methodist in Cedar Falls, the son of a hardware store owner who believed in hard work, honest dealing, and keeping your nose out of other people's business. My father, Gerald Thompson, ran Thompson's Hardware on Main Street from 1945 until he retired in 1985. Every morning at 6:30 sharp, he'd unlock those heavy glass doors and flip the sign from closed to open. I spent countless afternoons after school in that store, learning to sort screws by size, helping customers find the right wrench, breathing in the distinctive smell of fertilizer, paint, and metal that seemed permanently embedded in the wooden floors. "Son, treat people fair, and they'll treat you fair," my father used to say while we restocked shelves together. "Don't promise what you can't deliver, and always deliver what you promise." Simple wisdom from a simple man who never imagined his son would one day hold the spiritual lives of dozens of people in his hands. It was 1965 when 2 well-dressed men knocked on our front door on Elm Street. I was 17, helping my mother Dorothy tend her victory garden that she'd somehow never stopped maintaining even 20 years after the war ended. The men carried leather briefcases and spoke with the kind of confidence that made you want to listen, even when you weren't sure you agreed with what they were saying. "We're sharing a message of hope with your neighbors," the older one said. His name was Brother Patterson, and he had gray hair that never seemed to move, even when the Illinois wind picked up. "Would you like to learn what the Bible really teaches about God's kingdom?" My mother invited them in for coffee, as was her way. She'd grown up during the Depression, when hospitality wasn't just politeness, it was survival. We sat around our kitchen table with its yellow formica top and chrome legs, discussing prophecies and paradise while the afternoon light slanted through our checkered curtains. What attracted me wasn't just the message, it was the certainty. These men knew exactly what God wanted, when He wanted it, and how ordinary people like the Thompsons fit into His divine plan. After 18 months of Bible studies, I was baptized at a circuit assembly in Rockford, emerging from that portable baptism pool, feeling like I'd finally found my purpose in life. Evelyn Martinez came into my life in 1968 at a district convention in Chicago. She was 22, I was 20, and we both believed we were living in the last days of this wicked system of things. Her father had been disfellowshipped when she was 16 for questioning certain teachings, and she carried a deep need to prove her loyalty to the organization that had, in her mind, saved her from following his apostate path. "I never want to be like my father," she told me during one of our chaperoned walks around her neighborhood in the months before our marriage. "He let pride get in the way of submission to Jehovah's organization." And the pain in her voice when she spoke about him was real and raw. Her father, Miguel Martinez, had been a respected elder himself until he started asking questions about certain prophetic dates that didn't seem to align with history. We married in 1970 in a simple ceremony at the Kingdom Hall, with no worldly music, no dancing, no celebration that might stumble anyone's conscience. Evelyn wore a modest white dress she'd sewn herself, and I wore my father's suit from his own wedding 25 years earlier. Brother Patterson, the same man who'd first brought the truth to our family, gave a talk about the sacred arrangement of marriage and how Christian couples should conduct themselves in these last days. Our early years were marked by zealous service. We pioneered together, spending 90 hours each month going door to door in Cedar Falls and the surrounding farm communities. I remember trudging through snowdrifts to reach isolated farmhouses, carrying book bags heavy with literature and hearts heavy with the urgency of our message. We truly believed we were saving lives by sharing this truth with anyone who would listen. Sarah was born in 1974, and we dedicated her to Jehovah before she could even hold her head up properly. Every decision we made revolved around raising her in the truth, which friends she could have, which activities she could participate in, which parts of her education were acceptable, and which might expose her to worldly thinking. I was appointed as a ministerial servant in 1976, then as an elder in 1982. Each appointment felt like confirmation that Jehovah was blessing our faithful service. I gave talks at circuit assemblies, conducted judicial committees, and counseled families struggling with various spiritual challenges. People looked up to me, trusted me, came to me with their deepest problems and fears. But David Martinez, our presiding overseer, was a different kind of man than Brother Patterson had been. Where Patterson had been gentle and patient, Martinez was rigid and demanding. He'd been appointed presiding overseer in 1985, arriving from a congregation in Chicago where, according to him, they did things the right way. "Brother Thompson," he told me during one of our elders' meetings in 1987, "the organization has made it clear that we need to tighten up our standards. Too many publishers are getting comfortable with worldly thinking." His dark eyes had a hardness that made me uncomfortable, but I nodded agreement. After all, he was appointed by the circuit overseer, who was appointed by the district overseer, who answered directly to the society. The other elders seemed to fall in line easily enough. Brother Williams had been an elder for only 3 years, and was eager to prove himself worthy of greater responsibilities. Brother Jensen, our secretary, had been serving faithfully for over a decade, but had always deferred to stronger personalities. And Brother Foster, who handled our finances, seemed more concerned with keeping accurate records than questioning policies. It was during this period that I first noticed the disconnect between what we taught publicly and what we practiced privately. We preached about Christian love and forgiveness, but our judicial committees seemed more focused on punishment than restoration. We talked about the truth setting people free, but our rules seemed designed to control every aspect of a person's life. The Henderson case wasn't the first time I'd felt uncomfortable with our approach to handling problems. There had been Brother Morrison, who'd been disfellowshipped for celebrating his mother's 90th birthday with a small family dinner. Sister Clark, who'd been publicly reproved for allowing her non-witness sister to stay overnight during a family crisis. Young Michael Stevens, who'd been marked as bad association for asking too many questions during the book study. Each case had procedures, committees, carefully documented decisions that followed organizational guidelines exactly. But each case also involved real people with real pain, real families torn apart by rules that seemed to prioritize organizational unity over human compassion. "Brother Thompson, you seem troubled lately," Evelyn mentioned one evening in late 1989. We were sitting on our front porch, watching the sun set over the farm fields that stretched beyond our neighborhood. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and the roses she'd planted along our front walkway. "I'm fine," I replied, but we both knew I wasn't. How could I explain that the organization I'd given my life to was beginning to feel like something I didn't recognize? How could I tell her that sometimes, when I was conducting a judicial committee or giving counsel from the platform, I felt like I was playing a role rather than speaking from the heart? The truth was becoming more complicated than the simple certainties I'd embraced as a young man, and I was beginning to suspect that admitting uncertainty might be the most dangerous thing an elder could do. The year 1992 brought changes to Cedar Falls that seemed to mirror the shifting landscape of my own spiritual journey. The old Methodist church downtown finally got the new steeple they'd been fundraising for since I was a teenager. And Peterson's drugstore closed after 60 years of serving our community, replaced by a chain pharmacy that stayed open on Sundays and sold magazines we'd never seen on local shelves before. But the most significant change happened within our own Kingdom Hall walls. The circuit overseer's visit in March brought new instructions about handling what headquarters was calling increasing apostasy in congregations worldwide. Brother Martinez gathered us elders in our back room after the Thursday evening meeting, his expression more serious than usual. "Brothers, we need to discuss some sensitive matters," he began, spreading several letters from the society across our small conference table. The letterhead bore the familiar Watchtower logo, but the tone of these communications felt different from the encouraging spiritual food we usually received. These letters spoke of dangers, of wolves in sheep's clothing, of the need for constant vigilance against those who would undermine faith. The society has made it clear that even seemingly innocent questions can be signs of developing apostasy, Martinez continued, his finger tracing lines of text that had been highlighted in yellow. "We need to be especially watchful for publishers who express doubts about prophetic chronology, organizational procedures, or established doctrines." Brother Williams leaned forward eagerly. What kind of questions should we be watching for? At 28, he still had the enthusiasm of someone who believed that following rules precisely would somehow protect him from life's complexities. Martinez consulted his notes. Questions about 1975 and why the system didn't end as expected. Challenges to our understanding of the generation that saw 1914. Criticism of disfellowshipping practices or the two-witness rule. Each item on his list felt like a weight settling in my stomach. The two-witness rule. I'd been wrestling with that particular doctrine for months, ever since Sister Reynolds had approached me about her teenage daughter, Amanda. The girl had confided that her stepfather, Brother Davis, had been touching her inappropriately when her mother worked late shifts at the hospital. But Davis denied everything, and without 2 witnesses to the misconduct, our hands were tied according to organizational policy. Sister Reynolds, we understand your concern, I told her during our meeting in my living room the previous fall, but we must follow biblical procedures. Without corroborating testimony, we cannot take judicial action. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but I spoke them anyway because that's what elders were supposed to do. But Brother Thompson, she'd pleaded, tears streaming down her weathered face. Amanda is only 15. She's not making this up. Can't we at least report it to the authorities? The society has been clear about keeping these matters within the congregation whenever possible, I'd replied, hating myself even as I said it. We don't want to bring reproach on Jehovah's name by involving worldly authorities in spiritual matters. Amanda's behavior had deteriorated over the following months. Her grades dropped, she stopped participating in meetings, and she began associating with worldly teenagers from school. Eventually, she was disfellowshipped for moral misconduct. Ironically, the very outcome we'd claimed to be protecting her from by not reporting her stepfather's abuse. Now, sitting in that elders' meeting as Martinez outlined new procedures for identifying potential apostates, I couldn't stop thinking about Amanda Reynolds and how our rigid adherence to policy had failed her so completely. Brother Thompson, you've been quiet, Martinez observed, fixing me with that penetrating stare I'd grown to dread. Do you have concerns about implementing these new guidelines? Every instinct told me to voice my doubts, to challenge the wisdom of treating genuine spiritual questions as dangerous seeds of apostasy. But 30 years of conditioning held my tongue. No concerns, Brother Martinez. I just want to make sure we implement everything correctly. The lie came so easily, it frightened me. When had I become someone who said what was expected rather than what was true? Spring melted into summer, and with it came the Henderson situation that would test every principle I thought I understood. Jennifer Henderson had been asking increasingly pointed questions during our Tuesday evening book studies. Last week, she'd questioned why our literature consistently claimed that Jerusalem was destroyed in 607 BCE, when every historical source she'd consulted in her college library pointed to 587 BCE as the actual date. Sister Henderson, Brother Williams had interrupted during that study, we need to trust the faithful and discreet slave class to provide accurate information. Personal research beyond our publications can lead to spiritual shipwreck. But Jennifer persisted. I'm not trying to cause problems, Brother Williams. I just want to understand how we can be sure our calculations about 1914 are correct if the starting date might be wrong. The silence in the room had been deafening. 20 pairs of eyes looked everywhere except at Jennifer's earnest face. This wasn't the kind of question that had comfortable answers, and everyone seemed to sense it. After the study, Martinez pulled me aside. We need to arrange a shepherding call for the Henderson family. The girl is developing a dangerous, independent spirit. Independent spirit. In organizational terminology, that phrase was just short of calling someone an apostate. I'd used it myself when counseling publishers who showed signs of thinking too much about things they were supposed to simply accept on faith. The shepherding call took place on a humid Thursday evening in July. Martinez and I sat in the Henderson family's modest living room, surrounded by the same kind of simple furniture that filled most witness homes in Cedar Falls. Mr. Henderson, a quiet man who worked maintenance at the elementary school, looked uncomfortable having elders in his home for what everyone understood was a corrective visit rather than an encouraging one. Jennifer, Martinez began without preamble, your recent questions during book studies have been causing some concern among the brothers. We understand you're attending college, and worldly education can sometimes plant seeds of doubt about spiritual truths. Jennifer, a serious young woman with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn chin, met his gaze directly. "I'm not doubting spiritual truths, Brother Martinez. I'm trying to understand how historical facts relate to our prophetic interpretations. Isn't that what we're supposed to do when we study? We study the Bible with the help of the faithful and discreet slave," Martinez replied firmly. "Individual research that goes beyond our publications often leads to confusion and apostasy. The Society has provided all the information we need to understand God's truth." Something shifted inside me as I watched this exchange. Here was a young woman genuinely seeking truth, being told that seeking too hard was dangerous. Here were grown men discouraging critical thinking in the name of spiritual protection. Here was everything I'd once believed in being reduced to a system of intellectual control that brooked no questions and accepted no challenges. "But what if our publications contain errors?" Jennifer asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Shouldn't we want to correct mistakes rather than defend them?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, dangerous, obvious, impossible to ignore. I found myself holding my breath, waiting to see how Martinez would respond to such direct challenge to organizational infallibility. "Sister Henderson," he said slowly, "that kind of thinking is exactly what Satan uses to turn faithful Christians away from God's organization. The faithful and discreet slave makes adjustments when necessary, but questioning their authority is questioning Jehovah himself." I wanted to object, to point out the logical flaws in his reasoning, to defend Jennifer's right to ask honest questions about things that didn't make sense. But my tongue felt paralyzed by decades of conditioning that equated organizational loyalty with spiritual faithfulness. The meeting ended with Jennifer agreeing to be more careful about her questions and to focus her studies on approved publications rather than external sources. But I could see in her eyes the same look I'd been seeing in my own mirror lately, the expression of someone trying to reconcile what they were being told to believe with what they could observe to be true. Driving home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, past the familiar landmarks of my childhood and adult life, I felt like I was seeing everything with new eyes. The Methodist church where I'd been raised looked peaceful in the evening light, not like the false religious system I'd been taught it represented. The houses where my neighbors lived, their quiet lives seemed filled with the same hopes and struggles that occupied the lives of people in our Kingdom Hall, despite their supposed spiritual darkness. "How was the shepherding call?" Evelyn asked when I walked through our front door. She was sitting at our kitchen table, preparing her comments for the upcoming theocratic ministry school assignment. "Fine," I replied automatically, but the word felt hollow. Nothing about that evening had been fine. We'd taken a young woman's genuine search for truth and turned it into a spiritual crime. We'd elevated organizational authority above honest inquiry. We'd chosen institutional protection over individual spiritual welfare. For the first time in my 30 years as a witness, I found myself wondering if the organization I'd devoted my life to was really led by God, or if it was just another human institution more concerned with maintaining control than discovering truth. The thought terrified me, but I couldn't shake it loose, and deep down, I suspected that terror was exactly the response the organization was counting on to keep elders like me in line. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in September 1993. I know the exact time because I was staring at our digital alarm clock when the phone rang. Having been awake for hours, wrestling with thoughts that seemed to multiply in the darkness like shadows cast by a flickering candle. "Raymond?" Evelyn's voice was thick with sleep and confusion. "It's Dr. Harrison from Cedar Falls General." My heart stopped. Dr. Harrison was the emergency room physician who attended our Kingdom Hall, one of the few medical professionals in our small congregation. He wouldn't call at this hour unless something was seriously wrong. "Brother Thompson, I need you to get to the hospital immediately. Your wife collapsed at home about an hour ago. We've run some preliminary tests, and I need to discuss treatment options with you as soon as possible." The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of streetlights and racing thoughts. Evelyn had been complaining of fatigue and occasional dizziness for several weeks, but we'd attributed it to the busy schedule we kept with congregation responsibilities and her part-time job at the library. She'd insisted she was fine, just needed more rest. I found her in the emergency room, looking small and pale against the stark white sheets. Her usually bright brown eyes were dulled with exhaustion and something else, fear, perhaps, or resignation. Dr. Harrison met me in the hallway outside her room, his expression grave. "Raymond, I need to be direct with you. Evelyn has severe internal bleeding. Her hemoglobin levels have dropped to dangerously low levels, and without immediate intervention, we could lose her within hours." The words hit me like physical blows. "What kind of intervention?" "She needs blood transfusions, plural. Her body simply cannot produce red blood cells fast enough to replace what she's losing. We also need to perform emergency surgery to find and stop the source of the bleeding." Blood transfusions. The phrase hung between us like a sword suspended by a thread. In that moment, 30 years of organizational training collided with the most basic human instinct, the need to save the person you love most in the world. "Doctor, you know our religious position on blood transfusions. Surely there are alternatives." Dr. Harrison's face softened with compassion, but his voice remained firm. "Raymond, I've tried every alternative protocol we have available. Volume expanders, iron supplements, erythropoietin to stimulate red blood cell production. None of it is working fast enough. Without blood, she will die. It's that simple." I walked back into Evelyn's room feeling like I was moving underwater, every step requiring enormous effort. She was awake, watching me with eyes that held 35 years of shared history. "They told me what I need," she said quietly. "They told me what you have to decide. Evelyn, you know what the organization teaches about blood. We've always believed that accepting blood transfusions would cost us our eternal life." She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the harsh fluorescent light. "Raymond, I need to tell you something. These past months, watching what happened to Jennifer Henderson, seeing how the elders handled Amanda Reynolds' situation, listening to you wrestle with doubts you thought you were hiding, I've been doing some thinking of my own." My throat tightened. "What kind of thinking? Remember my father? The questions he asked before they disfellowshipped him? I never told you this, but I kept copies of his research, hidden in my sewing room all these years. Last month, while you were at that elders training session, I finally read through everything he'd compiled. The revelation hit me like cold water. Evelyn, my faithful, submissive wife who'd never questioned organizational authority, had been conducting her own spiritual investigation. Raymond, the blood doctrine, it's not as clear-cut as they've made it seem. The biblical prohibition was about eating blood, not medical transfusions that didn't exist when those scriptures were written. My father found dozens of examples where the organization changed its position on medical treatments over the years. I sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew you were struggling with your own doubts, and I didn't want to add to your burden. But lying here tonight, feeling my life slip away, I realize that dying for a doctrine that might be wrong seems like a terrible waste." Dr. Harrison appeared in the doorway. "I hate to interrupt, but we don't have much time. I need your decision about the blood transfusions." I looked at my wife, really looked at her, and saw not just the faithful witness woman I'd married, but the intelligent, questioning human being she'd always been underneath the organizational expectations. I saw the girl who'd sewn her own wedding dress, the woman who'd raised our daughter with patience and wisdom, the companion who'd walked beside me through 3 decades of joys and challenges. "Doctor, if we authorize the transfusions, what are her chances?" "With blood and surgery, I'd say 90% chance of full recovery. Without blood," he shook his head, She might have hours, certainly not days. And I thought about all the judicial committees I'd served on, all the decisions I'd made in the name of organizational loyalty. I remembered Amanda Reynolds's haunted eyes, Jennifer Henderson's earnest questions, the fear in voices of people who'd been told that thinking for themselves was spiritual suicide. "Evelyn, what do you want?" She reached for my hand with fingers that felt cold and fragile. "I want to live, Raymond. I want to see Sarah grow up and have children of her own. I want to grow old with you on our front porch, watching the seasons change in Cedar Falls. I want to live, even if it means the organization will reject us." The choice crystallized in that moment with startling clarity. I could follow organizational doctrine and watch my wife die for a rule created by men in Brooklyn who would never have to live with the consequences. Or I could choose love over law, conscience over conformity, human compassion over institutional control. "Dr. Harrison, please proceed with whatever treatment my wife needs, including blood transfusions." As the medical team sprang into action, I held Evelyn's hand and felt something inside my chest that had been constricted for years finally relax. For the first time in decades, I had made a decision based on what I believed was right, rather than what I was told was expected. I knew that when dawn came, our lives as Jehovah's Witnesses would be over. The organization that had shaped our identities for 30 years would cast us out as apostates. Our daughter might be forced to choose between her parents and her faith community. Friends would turn their backs on us, treating us as if we were dead. But in that sterile hospital room, watching color slowly return to my wife's face as the transfused blood began doing its life-saving work, I felt more spiritually alive than I had in years. The climax wasn't dramatic or violent. It was simply one man choosing love over fear in the quiet hours before sunrise in a small Illinois hospital. But that choice would reshape everything that came after. The surgery lasted 4 hours. I spent that time in the hospital waiting room, drinking bitter coffee from paper cups and watching the sun rise over Cedar Falls through windows that needed cleaning. Every few minutes, I'd catch myself starting to pray, then stopping when I realized I wasn't sure anymore who I was praying to or what I was asking for. Dr. Harrison found me there at 7:30 a.m., still wearing his surgical scrubs, but with the exhausted smile of someone who just saved a life. "The surgery went perfectly, Raymond. We found and repaired a bleeding ulcer that had been developing for months. With the blood transfusions and surgical repair, Evelyn should make a full recovery. She'll need to stay here for a few days, but she's going to be fine." Relief flooded through me so completely I had to sit down. My wife was going to live. The decision I'd made in the darkness of that emergency room had saved her life. But even as gratitude filled my chest, I knew the hardest part was still ahead of us. I called my supervisor at the grain elevator to let him know I wouldn't be coming to work, then drove home to shower and change clothes before the hospital allowed visitors. Our house on Elm Street looked exactly the same as it had 12 hours earlier, but everything felt different. The Kingdom Hall schedule posted on our refrigerator, the stack of watchtowers on our coffee table, the framed photograph of our family at last year's district convention, all of it belonged to people we no longer were. The phone was ringing when I walked through the front door. Brother Martinez's voice on the answering machine was carefully controlled, but I could hear the tension underneath. "Brother Thompson, I heard about Sister Evelyn's hospitalization. Brother Harrison contacted me with some concerning information about treatment decisions. We need to meet as soon as possible to discuss this matter. Please call me immediately." I stared at the machine, listening to his message replay in my mind. Brother Harrison, of course. He was probably required to report any congregation member who accepted blood transfusions. The organizational machinery was already grinding into motion, preparing to deal with our transgression. I didn't call Martinez back. Instead, I made coffee in our familiar kitchen and sat at the table where Evelyn and I had shared thousands of meals. planning what I would say to Sarah when she called asking about her mother's condition. Sarah was 21 now, married to a ministerial servant named David Chen, living in Springfield, where David worked at the state insurance office. They'd been trying to have children for 2 years, following all the organizational guidelines about proper family planning and spiritual readiness for parenthood. The call came at 10:15, just as I'd expected. Dad. Brother Martinez called David this morning and said Mom was in the hospital. What happened? Is she okay? How do you tell your daughter that her mother nearly died and that saving her life meant choosing between medical necessity and religious doctrine? How do you explain that the organization she'd been raised to revere as God's earthly representative might be wrong about something as fundamental as preserving life? Sarah, your mother had internal bleeding. She needed surgery and blood transfusions to survive. She's going to be fine, but there are going to be some complications with the congregation. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Dad, you didn't let them give her blood, did you? The pain in her voice cut through me like a blade. This was my daughter, the little girl who'd sat on my lap while I read her Bible stories, who'd given her first talk on the theocratic ministry school when she was 8 years old, who'd been baptized with tears of joy streaming down her face. Sarah, the doctors said she would die without blood. She would have died. But Dad, you know what accepting blood means. The organization has been clear about this. It's better to die faithful than to live as an apostate. Apostate. She'd used the word I'd been dreading, the label that would define us in the eyes of everyone we'd spent our lives serving alongside. I tried to explain our reasoning, Evelyn's research, the doubts that had been growing for months about various organizational teachings. But Sarah had been trained since childhood to view questioning as dangerous, and my explanation sounded like exactly the kind of rationalization apostates were known for making. The conversation ended with Sarah crying and promising to pray for our return to spiritual sanity. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen listening to the house settle around me, the familiar creaks and sighs of a building that had sheltered our family through 3 decades of certainty that was now crumbling away. I returned to the hospital that afternoon to find Evelyn awake and alert, her color much improved from the night before. She smiled when she saw me, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in months. "How do you feel?" I asked, settling into the chair beside her bed. "Physically, much better. Spiritually," she paused, considering her words carefully. "Free. Terrified, but free. Does that make sense?" It made perfect sense. The weight of organizational expectations, the constant vigilance required to maintain perfect spiritual appearance, the fear of making mistakes that might displease invisible authorities in Brooklyn, all of that had lifted the moment we chose to prioritize life over doctrine. "I called Sarah," I told her. "She's struggling with what we've done." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "She'll have to make her own choice about whether to shun us or not. I hope she chooses love over organizational loyalty, but I can't force that decision." Over the next 2 days, while Evelyn recovered from surgery, the organizational response to our situation became clear. Brother Martinez called twice more, leaving increasingly urgent messages about the need to meet with a judicial committee. Brother Williams stopped by the hospital, ostensibly to offer encouragement, but actually to determine whether we showed proper repentance for accepting blood transfusions. "Brother Thompson," he said, standing uncomfortably near the foot of Evelyn's hospital bed, "the whole congregation is praying for your family during this trial. We understand that medical emergencies can cause people to make decisions they later regret." The word regret hung in the air like an invitation. All we had to do was express remorse for saving Evelyn's life, submit to whatever discipline the Judicial Committee deemed appropriate, and we could return to our familiar positions in the organization. I could continue serving as an elder, making decisions I increasingly disagreed with. Evelyn could return to preparing Watchtower comments that reinforced teachings she'd discovered were questionable. We could pretend that nothing had fundamentally changed. "Brother Williams," Evelyn said from her hospital bed, her voice gentle but firm, "we're not going to apologize for choosing life. If that makes us apostates in the organization's eyes, then we'll have to accept that consequence." Williams left without another word, but his expression told us everything we needed to know about what would happen next. The Judicial Committee was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the Kingdom Hall. 3 men, who'd been my colleagues and friends for years, would sit in judgment of decisions made in a hospital room at 3 o'clock in the morning. They would follow organizational procedures, consult written guidelines from headquarters, and determine whether Raymond and Evelyn Thompson were fit to remain among Jehovah's Witnesses. I knew the outcome before the meeting ever took place. We'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, chosen medical science over organizational doctrine, prioritized individual conscience over collective authority. In the organization's binary worldview, there was no middle ground between absolute loyalty and complete apostasy. But sitting in that hospital room, watching my wife recover from surgery that had saved her life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the artificial peace that came from organizational approval, but the deep satisfaction of knowing I'd made the right choice when it mattered most. We were about to lose everything we'd built over 30 years of faithful service, but we'd gained something more valuable: the freedom to think for ourselves and the courage to act on our convictions, even when those convictions led us away from everything we'd once held sacred. The announcement came on a Thursday evening in October 1993, during the second half of our regular congregation meeting. I wasn't there to hear it, neither was Evelyn, but Sister Peterson called us afterward, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine sorrow. "Raymond, they announced that you and Evelyn are no longer Jehovah's Witnesses." The whole congregation went silent. Some people started crying. She paused, and I could hear her struggling with what to say next. "I wanted you to know that not everyone agrees with what happened, but we're not allowed to talk to you anymore. I'm sorry." The line went dead, and with it, 30 years of friendships, shared experiences, and community connections that had defined our adult lives. In less than 2 minutes of announcement time, Raymond and Evelyn Thompson had been erased from the social world of Cedar Falls Kingdom Hall. But something unexpected happened in the days that followed. Instead of the crushing despair I'd anticipated, I found myself waking each morning with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The constant anxiety about whether my thoughts, words, or actions might displease some distant authority had simply vanished. For the first time in decades, I could read a newspaper without filtering every story through organizational doctrine, have conversations with neighbors without mentally categorizing them as worldly people to be kept at arm's length. Evelyn recovered quickly from her surgery, her body responding well to the life-saving treatment she'd received, but more than that, her spirit seemed to heal from wounds I hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The woman who'd spent 25 years as an elder's wife, always careful, always appropriate, always conscious of setting a proper example, began to rediscover parts of herself that had been buried under layers of organizational expectation. "I want to take art classes," she announced one evening about a month after our disfellowshipping. We were sitting on our front porch watching the autumn leaves drift down from the maple tree we'd planted the year Sarah was born. Art classes. At the community college. I always wanted to learn to paint, but there was never time between meetings, field service, and congregation responsibilities. Now we have time. Sarah's response to our situation proved more painful than losing our congregation friends. David, her husband, was appointed as a ministerial servant shortly after our disfellowshipping, a promotion that required him to demonstrate his loyalty to the organization by completely cutting off contact with apostate family members. Sarah called once in December, sobbing as she told us she loved us but couldn't risk her spiritual standing by maintaining a relationship. "Maybe someday the organization will change its shunning policies," she said through her tears. "Maybe you'll come back to the truth. Until then, I have to trust that Jehovah knows what's best. That conversation was our last direct contact with our daughter for more than 3 years, but other relationships began to bloom in the space left by those we'd lost. Dr. Harrison, who'd been forced to report our acceptance of blood transfusions, sought us out privately to express his admiration for our courage. "I've seen too many witness families torn apart by that blood doctrine," he told us. "It takes tremendous strength to choose your conscience over your community." My neighbor Tom Bradley, a Methodist minister I'd politely avoided for 2 decades, became an unexpected friend. He never tried to convert us to his faith, never suggested we were lost souls in need of salvation. Instead, he offered something the Kingdom Hall had never provided: acceptance without conditions, fellowship without conformity requirements. "Faith should expand your world, not contract it," he told me during one of our evening walks around the neighborhood. "When religion becomes more about what you can't do than what you can become, something's gone wrong." I returned to work at the grain elevator with relief, discovering that my colleagues cared more about my reliability and competence than my religious affiliation. The manager who'd given me time off during Evelyn's crisis never asked why I'd stopped attending Kingdom Hall meetings, never made me feel like I needed to explain or defend our personal choices. Evelyn did enroll in those art classes, spending Tuesday and Thursday evenings learning watercolor techniques instead of attending congregation meetings. Her paintings, mostly landscapes of the farmland surrounding Cedar Falls, began filling our house with colors and images that had nothing to do with organizational literature or approved spiritual themes. "I never realized how much I needed beauty that wasn't filtered through someone else's interpretation," she said, cleaning her brushes after a session painting the sunset over Peterson's Pond. "Art doesn't require approval from headquarters." We began attending the Methodist church where I'd been raised, not because we'd embraced a new set of doctrines, but because the community welcomed questions instead of fearing them. The pastor, Reverend Morrison, encouraged discussion, debate, and individual spiritual exploration in ways that felt revolutionary after decades of imposed certainty. "God's big enough to handle your doubts," he told us during one of our getting acquainted conversations. If faith can't survive honest questions, it wasn't worth having in the first place. The hardest part of our new life was learning to trust our own judgment after 30 years of deferring to organizational authority. Simple decisions, what books to read, which holiday celebrations to participate in, how to spend our leisure time, required conscious effort because we'd become accustomed to checking every choice against published guidelines from Brooklyn. But gradually, we developed confidence in our own moral compass. We discovered that people could be kind, honest, and ethically motivated without sharing our former religious beliefs. We learned that questioning authority didn't lead to moral chaos, but to deeper personal responsibility for our choices. In 1997, Sarah reached out to us again, this time because she was struggling with questions of her own. David had been disfellowshipped for what the organization called gross moral misconduct, apparently involving financial improprieties at his workplace. The same judicial committee system that had cast us out had now targeted her husband, and she was experiencing firsthand the harsh reality of organizational discipline. "Dad, they're making me choose between supporting David through his mistakes and maintaining my standing in the congregation," she told us during a cautious phone call. "How do I choose between my marriage and my faith?" It was the beginning of a slow reconciliation. Sarah never officially left the organization, but she began making choices based on love and family loyalty rather than organizational demands. She chose her marriage over her congregation's approval, her parents over the shunning doctrine, her own conscience over imposed rules. Today, 15 years after that early morning phone call from Dr. Harrison, Evelyn and I live quietly in the same house on Elm Street, where we raised our daughter and served the organization that ultimately rejected us. Our granddaughter visits regularly, a bright 8-year-old who's growing up free from the fears and restrictions that shaped Sarah's childhood. Sometimes former Kingdom Hall acquaintances wave to us downtown, usually when no other witnesses are around to observe their momentary humanity. A few have even stopped to chat, expressing private doubts about organizational policies while maintaining their public loyalty to avoid the social consequences we experienced. I don't regret the choice we made in that hospital room. Evelyn is healthy and vibrant at 71, pursuing interests and friendships that enrich our lives in ways organizational service never did. We've learned that losing everything you thought defined you can be the beginning of discovering who you really are. The organization continues its work in Cedar Falls and around the world, still claiming exclusive access to divine truth, still demanding unquestioning loyalty from its members. But we've found something more valuable than organizational approval: the peace that comes from living according to your own carefully examined conscience, and the joy of relationships based on genuine affection rather than conditional acceptance. Sometimes, the most faithful thing you can do is walk away from a faith that has stopped serving the God of love it claims to represent. This is a true story shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us. If you also have a story you'd like to share, write in the comments. We'll be very happy to tell your story on our channel.